Okay, now that that's out of the way, we can get started. I'm going to go through each episode of Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse and talk about why it's dumb. So you've seen the snappy edits. You gotta have a bwong. Ancient Apocalypse presents a sweeping claim that a forgotten Ice Age civilization, which transmitted knowledge to later cultures throughout the world, built a pyramid in Indonesia. But archaeology isn't built on speculation, it's built on evidence. Excavations, artifacts, texts, and from all of that, peer-reviewed research. In this video, we'll examine several of the key arguments used to support Graham Hancock's idea, claims about lost civilizations, archaeological excavations, and a global flood tradition. So what happens when we compare those sources with the claims made in Ancient Apocalypse? I want you to pay attention to his unassuming manner. He hesitates a little bit when he introduces himself, which endears him to the audience. It's charming because it suggests he doesn't take himself too seriously and that he might be a bit shy or even unsure of himself. Kind of direct contrast to the snappy editing of him being on a mountaintop and getting the bwong, but it's utterly disarming the way he is, and that sort of primes you to assume that he's being earnest. This is really cleverly done.
Well, I'm Graham Hancock.
He immediately tells you that he does not claim to be an archaeologist or a scientist. This doubles down on his believability, as he's relinquishing the labels that people typically earn through academic efforts, so he isn't stepping on those toes here. It feels he's more approachable because of that, and that he may even be separating himself from those careers and industries as a sign of respect. I promise it isn't, and I'll show you why shortly. Since the early 90s, or arguably 1982, he's really more accurately a book writer. In his own words, from his own book, The Sign and the Seal, Chapter 17, Hancock states that he abandoned his former profession of journalism and set up a publishing company to produce books for clients like African governments. This is yet another form of manipulation because he's further painting himself as a quote-unquote seeker of truth rather than someone with an agenda. And by using this phrasing rather than calling himself a writer, he's trying to guide you to think that there is a story waiting to be uncovered, journalism style. Despite being the one with the agenda, he's flipping the roles to seem like the party uncovering an agenda. And to say he isn't an archaeologist or a scientist, truthfully, and then say instead he's a journalist, he's setting himself up as someone who can ask any kind of outrageous questions and make claims that he knows archaeologists would not. So he gets all of the benefits and none of the responsibilities. International travel to, especially an American audience, is effective as an example of expertise, as it has a mystique that isn't widely attainable for a lot of us, because our country's geography and economic system encourage domestic rather than international travel. So this isn't necessarily malicious of Graham, but it does distance him from the average American viewer, at least, probably affording him more credibility than he's really due. He's already primed the viewer to think there's quote-unquote more to the story, in general, for archaeology, then has his contributors spell out such messaging as well. This point is in fact nefarious, as he is almost coquettish about suggesting that archaeologists whose careers are focused on these highlighted subjects aren't doing their job and are in fact hiding knowledge from the public. That's in direct contradiction to what archaeology ever wants to do, but okay.
That automatically makes me enemy number one to archaeologists.
Now for the funniest part. Enemy number one. I'm sure that among the myriad struggles that archaeologists, historians, and the academics for those industries face each day, you are not one. He is now crystallizing a point he merely hinted at before, that he is a rogue, an underdog against a titanic industry of people richer and more powerful than he is. I can assure you that none of them have a Netflix deal, nor work with multiple commercial book publishers on the regular. Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House, Macmillan, all have a page dedicated to him. They do, however, run into shrinking budgets for conservation and heritage, and the universe of departments that train those industries, to say nothing of the standard issue competitiveness of grants for archaeological projects and the ensuing red tape necessary from their own governments and insurance, as well as that of the country in which they hope to excavate. But yeah, it's you, babe. So the idea that you think that believing in, quote, an advanced civilization from the Ice Age is what garners you the ire of anyone is purposely obtuse. It's that you believe that these artifacts and ancient sites exist not because of the people indigenous to that time and place, but to your own imaginary Ice Age civilization. So not only do you swipe credit from indigenous populations in favor of an imaginary Ice Age culture, along with saying you're not an archaeologist, but also they don't know what they're talking about while I do, it might also have something to do with the fact that you're not looked on favorably by quote-unquote big archaeology.
We don't know. This is a spectacular mystery, and leave it at that. It's my job to offer an alternative point of view.
Is it your job because it pays better than Ethiopian strongman dictators?
I'm trying to overthrow the paradigm of history.
Overthrow the paradigm of history. Big claims need big evidence. Why do you want to overthrow it? What do you know that archaeologists don't?
The mainstream version of history says that after the end of the Ice Age,
the mainstream version of history says. Notice he's used this phrase, mainstream archaeology. This is his most eloquent dig so far, and the only kind of dig he's ever done. He's taking a leaf out of the book that you haven't heard of the infinity-scarved hipster of yore. Oh, you like mainstream archaeology? You haven't heard of the real archaeology like I have. He's using the word mainstream to cheapen the industry as if it's some corporately shilled, mass-produced product for airheaded consumption only. This alone is enough to tell me that he's never interacted with archaeologists, because if he had, he'd realize there are a lot of semi-rabid dorks with hyperfixations. He's subverting real work and breakthroughs in the industry in the interest of being the sole guide for you to see the light that he crafted and that you have to pay to see and understand via purchases of his books or a Netflix subscription. This is the methodology adopted by that snake oil salesman fella in Wizard of Oz who ends up being the man behind the curtain. Big claim of a lost civilization of the Ice Age. Now that he's primed you to think that he's the only honest person looking into some hidden agenda, he drops this bomb. In industries like archaeology, big claims require big evidence. So let's see what big evidence he has to offer. In academic presentations, typically the thesis is stated, then the evidence to back it follows. Graham is forthright about his lack of academic credentials in archaeology, so now that he's submitted his big claim to you, he's not offering you evidence, but instead giving you some reasons that you should believe him. That's the methodology more in line with a sales pitch on an internet commercial. The product is introduced, then the person selling it explains why you should trust them. Graham uses really the only weapon he has, his travel, as evidence of expertise. By the way, a note here, the terminology used today in the industry is culture. The term civilization has some stickiness that makes it outdated. Basically, and we'll get into this a bit later, but the way that 19th century quote-unquote archaeologists thought about other cultures was Eurocentric. That is, they thought they were the end point or the pinnacle of an evolution of civilization, and that all other populations were simply behind, hoping to catch up or evolve to their level.
this idea is upsetting to the so-called experts.
We've just witnessed Graham's ad hominem count number 1. Graham's first swipe at the people he sees as his enemies. Quote, "This idea is upsetting to the so-called experts." He's planting a seed in you of academics or industry experts as reacting in some highly emotional way, and that he calls them, quote, "so-called experts" to boot, when his own knowledge and expertise amounts to only passport stamps. He's already playing dirty, and we are just about at minute 3.
Who insist that the only humans who existed during the Ice Age were simple hunter-gatherers.
Next, he uses the phrase simple hunter-gatherers. Graham says that the, quote, "so-called experts" insist, here again, language suggesting someone is unreasonable or overly emotional, insist that the only humans who existed during the Ice Age are simple hunter-gatherers. This language, too, is important because he's telling on himself here. The quote-unquote only humans are, quote, simple hunter-gatherers. From that choice of words, because he has curated each of his words and recordings of his own speech thus far, what do you understand about his opinion of hunter-gatherers? To me, he sounds disappointed that there were no other humans who did something, quote-unquote, more than hunting and gathering. This really annoys me because there's nothing simple-minded, or even slightly easy about living as a hunter-gatherer, and nor should that lifestyle suggest that they are, because there are those who still exist, or were, simple-minded. It is not an insult to be or to be called a hunter-gatherer, despite Hancock's implication.
But perhaps the extremely defensive, arrogant, and patronizing attitude of mainstream academia is stopping us from considering that possibility.
Extremely defensive, arrogant, and patronizing. Isn't it patronizing and arrogant to tell archaeologists they don't know what they're talking about when you've just admitted that you yourself don't know what they're talking about? In fact, this entire framework comes off as very defensive. Definitely no patronizing arrogance here.
On their own initiative, our hunter-gatherer ancestors suddenly began farming and raising livestock.
Then he says, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, of their own initiative, suddenly began farming and raising livestock. Of their own initiative. He's setting up another subject, that of a pre-flood high-tech civilization. This is a major theme in alt history and pseudoarchaeology fictional timelines. And then he says, suddenly. If you want a neat read about what exactly suddenly means in the archaeological record, Stephen Mithen has a book called After the Ice, and he takes you all over the Neolithic sites of the world and describes the different levels of pastoralism, the seedlings of agriculture, and brings you to the brink of permanent settlements in each region. It's on Internet Archive for free, and it's over 20 years old, but that means that Graham Hancock has had more than 2 decades to read even just one book that describes how gradual and variable these developments occurred across different regions of the world. To be honest, Netflix should adapt this book with updated archaeological information for each site because it's actually perfect for their format.
Different cultures at different levels of development have always lived alongside one another.
Levels of development echoes that Victorian era interpretation of cultures all being in different states racing to the European ideal.
7,000 years ago, far from being builders on such an epic scale, there's no evidence that the people of this region were anything other than simple hunter-gatherers.
Simple hunter-gatherers again, but he'll claim it's archaeologists who are the ones who disrespect hunter-gatherers. Then he pins the reason that we should respect them on this manufactured idea that they have built this pyramid.
Tribe of hunter-gatherers living atop the hill around 7,000 years ago wouldn't have been capable of building a structure of this colossal size and complexity.
He also says, the accepted timeline of human history tells us that the tribe of hunter-gatherers living near the hill around 7,000 years ago wouldn't have been capable of building a structure of this colossal size and complexity. And actually, no. It isn't about mental or physical capability at this point in history. The humans of 50,000 BC, are just the same to us, just as they were in 5,000 BC, which is the time he's talking about. Capability is not at all a factor here. Simply, it's that archaeologists have not found pyramids older than Caral Supe so far. And so it's more that we don't have evidence yet that hunter-gatherers built anything like this.
Discoveries keep on pushing that horizon back.
New discoveries keep pushing that horizon back. Recent evidence disputes only the timing of sites on an individual basis. If a real, worldwide, post-Ice Age, quote-unquote, high civilization existed in the way that he and his compatriots suggest, then evidence would overwhelmingly point to, indeed, a sudden and world-encompassing switch from one way of life to another. Instead, these people, our ancestors, had to figure things out for themselves. What grit they had. To suggest that they were simply taught by some quote-unquote higher being is an insult to literally all of humanity. And then he uses the word civilizations again. This is actually that 19th century Eurocentric usage that I mentioned in action. Yay!
This is Gunung Padang. But Dr. Hillman has found evidence that Gunung Padang could be even older.
Even older. It's always even older, because that's really their only trick.
Gunung Padang is like no place else on Earth.
Now he says that Gunung Padang confounded mainstream archaeologists, and that it is like no place else on Earth. Let me tell you why both of those are lies. Spoilers here. Gunung Padang is a columnar basalt mountain. What that means is that when lava starts to cool, quote, contractional joints or fractures form. If a flow cools relatively rapidly, significant contraction forces build up. While a flow can shrink in the vertical dimension without fracturing, it cannot easily accommodate shrinking in the horizontal direction unless cracks form. The extensive fracture network that develops results in the formation of columns. These structures, or basalt prisms, are predominantly hexagonal in cross-section, but polygons with 3 to 12 or more sides can be observed. The size of the columns depends loosely on the rate of cooling. Very rapid cooling may result in very small columns, like under 1 centimeter in diameter, while slow cooling is more likely to produce large columns. So the naturally forming hexagonal columns did not, in fact, confound those pesky mainstream archaeologists. Why not? Well, because it was not unlike anywhere else on Earth. Wikipedia has an entire page dedicated to, quote, a list of places with columnar basalt volcanics. Let me give you one for 6 of 7 continents. In Africa, the organ pipes of Namibia. Asia, Gunung Kelud in Indonesia, not terribly far from our subject of this episode. In North America, you can go to the Devil's Tower in the US, or the Los Tercios waterfall in El Salvador. In Oceania, the Bridal Veil Falls of New Zealand. And in South America, the Pino Achado caldera in Argentina. There's a link to that photo in my description.
The columnar joint is imported from another region, from another location.
How do you know that? I said, how do you know that?
That means that every one of these blocks, up to 50,000 of them, and each weighing up to 1/3 of a ton, were carried up.
How do you know that? How do you know the blocks are from somewhere else? Maybe if you told us how you know that, we could then understand why that idea was extrapolated to 50,000 other blocks than the one or few, or probably none, that were allegedly tested. Well, you know I couldn't let it go because I have something wrong in my brain, so I had to verify this as much as possible. The references in my arsenal were the following papers. The first by Victor Luis Perez Garcia, the second by Diane Sulistiowati, the third would have been by Tony Giubiantono, and the last was from Lutfi Yondri.
Oddly hexagonal stone slabs, strewn about everywhere.
The feat of basically taking all of these blocks and dragging them up the hill The feat would take on even more colossal dimensions if we listen to those who claim that the blocks were not carved in situ, but were moved from distant quarries. So imagine the effort and technical difficulties to carry it out. What that would have meant for a Paleolithic society that had neither metal tools nor draft animals. Or is it perhaps that they did know them, and everything that history and archaeology have told us to date are just lies or mistakes? My apologies as well, this is translated from Spanish. Among these pseudoarchaeologists, there is a group that also argues that the enormous quantity of prismatic stone blocks found in the area were not only intentionally stacked, but also carved by human hands, which would already represent an extraordinary feat even for a modern, technological society like our own, considering the thousands or millions of geometrically columned rocks stacked on top of each other.
Had been cut, repurposed as building materials, and placed by human hands.
Next, we have Diane Sulistio-Watti's paper. I go into more depth with this paper in another video based on the Gunung Padang phenomenon, but I found this section that says, subsequent studies of Gunung Padang were oriented towards understanding the site's context and function. In 1981, researchers discovered a fifth terrace, and petrographic studies of the columnar joints conducted by the Archaeological Center of West Java in the 1990s revealed that the stone pillars were likely local and quarried from a volcanic quarry north of Gunung Padang. Here she cites Jubiantono 1996 and 7, and then Yondri and Jubiantono 2003. However, when I went to the sources, the only Jubiantono that I could find in the sources, I could not find the actual paper online. I went to find him at ResearchGate, Google Scholar, that kind of thing. I was able to find a paper he co-authored called Endocranial Anatomy of New Homo erectus Specimen from Sangiran of Java, Indonesia. I don't know how it's pronounced, sorry. That was from 2010, and he has something from 2021, a late Pleistocene and Holocene, something or other. So he's doing this really intensive research anyway. I just can't find his 1996 and 1997 paper. So, that leads us finally to Dr. Lutfi Yondri. And I found quite a bit from him, most notably a 2017 book, which I had to translate from Indonesian. Because I wanted to isolate information about the columnar basalt, I translated the word basalt into Indonesian and then did a control find thing on the Internet Archive book for the Indonesian word for basalt. And this is what I found so far. Firstly, I thought I found the site that Diane was discussing in her paper when I found a section on page 48 that says, Mount Padang is located south of Pasir Pogor and the Cianjur geological map. Based on geological mapping results, the lithology of Mount Padang includes tough breccia, I don't know how to say any of this, lava sandstone, conglomerate, basalt andesite formations, and is of Pliocene age. So because I don't know anything about that, I asked ChatGPT, which is probably not the best thing to do in the world, but I said, can you help me understand something in plain English? And I just copied all of that, and it told me that basically Mount Padang is made of relatively young volcanic rocks laid down a few million years ago, while the rocks north of it in Pasir Pogor are much older and come from a different volcanic event entirely. They are not part of the same structure, nor are they even the same age. Then I searched for the Jubiantono paper, and I found a few passages that might be of interest. Meanwhile, in the previous year of 1996-1997, a team from the Padang Archaeological Center also conducted research activities at the Gunung Padang site, which were specifically for petrographic analysis of Gunung Padang rocks and rocks originating from the quarry located to the north of Gunung Padang. Quote, "The results of the 2003 excavation work, conducted by a team from the Padang Archaeological Center, which involved opening excavation blocks on terraces 1, 3, and 4, allowed for comparison on the density of stone blocks deposited beneath the surface of the Gunung Padang site. Beneath the surface of the excavation block on terrace 1, a layer of stone blocks was found, covered by a crust of stone resulting from the weathering of the core stone. These stone blocks were oriented east-west, differing from the orientation of the stone blocks on the surface. Meanwhile, excavations on the third and fourth terraces revealed no natural stone blocks, as was found during excavations on terrace 1. This finding led to the suspicion that the stone blocks used to construct the Gunung Padang terraced pyramids in the past likely originated from Mount Padang itself. Quote, "Based on petrological analysis, findings from excavations on the Gunung Padang terraces, and comparisons with regional surveys, it can be concluded that the columnar rock material that makes up the Gunung Padang terraced pyramid originates from the same location, Mount Padang itself. It is highly likely that the rock material was mined from the Gunung Padang site itself, and then used to construct all parts of the Gunung Padang terraced pyramid, from the well at the foot of Mount Padang, through the ascending stairs, then terrace 1, to the highest terrace, terrace 5. Observations of the surface of the columnar stones used as the source material for Gunung Padang terraced pyramid also revealed no traces of any processing. This is evidenced by the rock surface, which lacks any carving marks, and its flat surface, with a distribution of pores, or air holes, created during the rock cooling process." From page 137, "Because the source material is located on the site itself, the stones were likely transported to the construction site using a simple technique involving pushing or pulling each block individually. Therefore, the number of stone blocks used to construct the Gunung Padang terraced pyramid required a considerable amount of stone blocks, while the population at that time was still small. It is strongly suspected that the construction process depended heavily on the spirit of togetherness and unity of the community, driven by religious emotion, and on leaders capable of rallying the community to complete the structure at that time." Now these following selections are from an article that posted a photo of the quote-unquote pyramid, but reconstructed with CGI, and it's very misleading, to say the least. So this article is heavily biased in favor of Nadawijaja's claims. Quote, "Nadawijaja's team came to these conclusions by comparing the ages of samples from the volcanic base layer, which is millions of years old, to the 3 layers of construction. In contrast to the volcano, soil samples taken from between fragmented rocks have been dated to only a few thousand to a few tens of thousands of years old, which presents an enigma in natural geological processes," says Nadawijaja. "Geological principles dictate that soils cannot migrate from the near-surface layers to deeper depths over time. Hence, the juxtaposition of relatively young soils between ancient rock layers poses a significant geological challenge." The conclusion? Only a technologically advanced culture during the Ice Age could have positioned those stones. Recognizing the impact of the findings, Nadawijaja once told the Sydney Morning Herald, "It's crazy, but it's data." From the same article biased in favor of Nadawijaja, it says, "Another opposing view comes from Professor Sutikno Branto of the Center of Geological Survey in Indonesia. He believes that Gunung Padang is the neck of a nearby volcano and not an ancient pyramid. Sutikno argues that the findings of younger soil layers among older stones and the carbon-dated material at the site do not substantiate Nadawijaja's claims. He suggests these are the results of natural erosion, not indicators of human architectural activity." So based on the information I gathered, Graham Hancock and Drs. Akbar and Nadawijaja either do not know that they are incorrect and disagree with Lutfi Yandri, or they lied. Nadawijaja is himself a geologist, and I don't pretend to know the intricacies of that industry and its specializations, so I couldn't say if it was even his business to know the provenance issues or the lack thereof. To address the possibility of the stones being from another site, Yandri's book cites the petrological study of Sutikno Bronto and Billy S. Lange, and outright says that the stones of Gunung Padang come from the Mount Padang itself, not a different site. So the people who arranged the blocks and created the archaeological site dating to about 500 BCE picked them up from Mount Padang, the carrying and arrangement of which would have required communal efforts, as Yandri addresses. Yandri also determined that the blocks show no signs of carving or cutting, and that they are naturally formed. You can tell because of the little air bubbles on them. This is what experts do, rely on other experts, especially in fields for which they are not themselves experts. Yandri the archaeologist defers to Bronto and Lange the volcanologists. He is therefore not pulling a Nadawijaja and making archaeological claims that have no supporting evidence as a geologist. Therefore, I can only conclude that Graham Hancock and Ali Akbar's assertion that the blocks are from elsewhere is, malicious or not, false.
There are some archaeologists I've heard who are still convinced that this is all entirely natural. I mean, I know this is natural rock, but they're suggesting the whole layout of the thing is natural as well.
He says that the archaeologists claim that the layout is natural, but notice he doesn't name drop. He just disdains them broadly. So it's not that he's being classy by omitting names, it's just more that he doesn't know any. So he's pulling this out of his ass.
But here, in between these columnar rocks, there is a mortar that holds them together, just like cement.
I believe the quote-unquote mortar was addressed by Perez Garcia's paper, as well as it was either Yandri or Bronto, and it was determined to be a natural phenomenon. Notice as well where they are when they're discussing this supposed mortar. They had to find some slanted earth area difficult to get to demonstrate this theory. And if it had been a consistent thing, if it had a consistent appearance throughout the site, rather than just right here, surely they would have shown some that were easier to access for the camera crew. I know a part of these types of shows is to somewhat exoticize the area, so maybe they wanted somewhere more crooked, but that begs the question, if you have this sample, where are the others?
5 centimeters, and it's very consistent.
More, you'll note that they claim it is consistently 5 centimeters throughout, yet there is no tool measuring this to prove it. That's because they're eyeballing it, and lying instead, whether by never measuring this from end to end, or by suggesting that, even if this example is indeed consistently 5 centimeters across, there are innumerable more.
Into what can best be described as a step pyramid.
This quote-unquote pyramid is estimated to be older than those in Egypt. A number of archaeologists and volcanologists still doubt this. To date, there is no research report from the Integrated Independent Research Team that can be used as a reference. News about the team's research can only be found online. Their equally compelling conclusion, published in 2012, is the chronology of the Mount Padang site, dating it to an extremely ancient date, between 13,000 and 23,000 BC, and it is said that this discovery will change the map of world civilization. The results of the research by the Independent Integrated Research Team were later published by Ali Akbar under the title The Site of Mount Padang, Mystery and Archaeology. The 266-page book was published in Jakarta by Change Publications. It came out at a time of intense media coverage of the controversy surrounding the research results at Mount Padang, conducted by the Independent Integrated Research Team, while Akbar himself served as the head of the archaeology division within the team. Akbar elaborates on Mount Padang at length, with each section accompanied by a question mark. Near the end of the book, Akbar makes an interesting statement, expressing doubt about his work. He states, "Sometimes some of these steps may be considered wrong, but when they are proven wrong, the blame can be placed on the author. However, the vision he put forward should be able to be continued by others with better steps."
This is the ancient site of Gunung Padang.
Also, just take a moment to imagine if Netflix used this budget as you're looking at this ancient, quote-unquote, recreation of Gunung Padang's pyramid. Imagine if Netflix used this budget to show archaeological sites like in need of restoration. I mentioned earlier Stephen Mithen's After the Ice. It is ripe for adaptation, with a reconstruction of the archaeological scene at the beginning of each site's chapter or section. I'm telling you, it's perfect for this.
How do we define a pyramid? But if we define it as a structure that rises in a series of terraces to a summit, that's what we're looking at.
So he wants to define a pyramid as a series of terraces to a summit. The Giza examples don't really have terraces, nor does the step pyramid of Saqqara, and even Dr. Nadawi Jaja says, Gunung Padang is not the same shape as the world's most iconic pyramids. So with Victor Luis Perez Garcia's paper, you can see he's got the details of what the pyramid, quote-unquote pyramid, would look like. Regarding the supposed existence of a secret chamber at the heart of the pyramid, pseudoarchaeologists have rushed to claim it was a tomb or some other type of artificial underground construction without having carried out any excavation. To be completely objective, the studies of 2012 to 13 show only a small, naturally occurring cavity inside the mountain, a cave or grotto of volcanic origin without any pattern or indication of regularity, formed by an ancient lava tunnel. Once again, we see how the creators of sensational fantasies have taken advantage to directly invent what they wish it were without having enough proof or clear and irrefutable evidence. Regarding a 2015 book, within this subsection there are 3 articles on Mount Padang. The first is written by Danny Hillman Nadawi Jaja, entitled The Pyramid of Mount Padang, Evidence of Sundaland Civilization from the Ice Age. The second is written by Lutfi Yandri, entitled Mount Padang, Archaeology and Cultural Value. And the third is written by Sutikno Bronto, entitled Mount Padang and Its Surroundings Geologically. The last 2 authors concluded that Mount Padang is natural, with no cultural remains, while the first author maintained his view that what was buried within Mount Padang was a pyramid.
This is an idea that mainstream archaeology finds very hard to accept. The notion that it's a man-made structure is no longer seriously disputed by anybody.
False.
Dr. Hillman and his team turned to another geological tool, core drilling.
Finally, I wanted to mention here that core drilling is very destructive. Hillman Nadawi Jaja calls it a cultural layer that they're drawing from, but remember, they don't tell us what makes it a cultural layer. Typically, the evidence of human presence is discussed and shown in an archaeological presentation because nobody likes to just go on someone's word. In fact, this very aspect is why the Hillman Nadawi Jaja paper was redacted shortly after publication and the release of this episode.
With structural elements now deeply buried. What archaeology finds very hard to swallow and very hard to accept is that the origins of this structure could date back as much as 24,000 years.
What I'm highlighting here is that I think he's talking about the Younger Dryas period, which Wikipedia calls the most recent cooling, which began around 12,800 years ago and ended around 11,700 years ago.
I can't help wondering whether those chambers contain some evidence or information that might have a bearing on my search for a lost civilization.
Now regarding the age estimates, and I found this just on Wikipedia, which I love. Archaeologist Lutfi Yandri from the Bureau of Archaeology in Bandung has estimated that the structures at Gunung Padang may have been built sometime between the 2nd and 5th centuries CE, thus in the Indonesian late prehistoric period, whereas Harry Truman's Simanjuntak has suggested a later date in historical times, between the 6th and 8th centuries CE. Pottery fragments found at the site were dated by the Bureau of Archaeology in the range of 45 BCE to 22 CE. Finally, the methodology used by Nadawi Jaja's team has received countless criticisms from scientists and academics due to its irregularities and errors, both in its practical application and in its theoretical interpretation of the data. Therefore, it is unacceptable to accept as valid the incredible proposed dates which, moreover, lack any other archaeological support. In October 2023, an article by Nadawi Jaja et al., published in Archaeological Prospection, claimed that Gunung Padang is the oldest pyramid in the world, dating as far back as 27,000 years ago. In March 2024, the publisher of Archaeological Prospection, Wiley, and the editors retracted that paper, stating that, quote, the radiocarbon dating was applied to soil samples that were not associated with any artifacts or features that could reliably be interpreted as anthropogenic or man-made. Therefore, the interpretation that the site is an ancient pyramid built 9,000 or more years ago is incorrect, and the article must be retracted.
I've been arguing that there was a massive global cataclysm about 12,500 years ago that wiped out almost all traces.
I said, how do you know that?
The scholars seem reluctant to get to grips with is that the Ice Age was a very special time, when the world was very different.
I'm not really sure why he's suggesting scholars don't agree with the idea that the last Ice Age had lower sea levels when that's who came up with it in the first place. He's almost suggesting he came up with it instead by the way he's worded this.
Between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, the oceans of the world rose dramatically in a series of immense deluges.
Look at him lying again.
Every ancient culture preserved traditions of a great flood that swallowed up the earth.
Here in Indonesia, the Batak people have their own version of this global flood myth.
So I wanted to see the source for the Batak myth because I've learned that I can't take Graham at his word. So when the Wikipedia page didn't offer any hints about a flood, I followed old Google to the only source I could find with ease, because I put enough into this video so far, but I did want to illustrate how time-consuming even casual research can be. So it took me to this curious taxonomy website by Mark Isaac, and the only two sources he used for his retelling of the Batak flood myth are Fraser and Kelson, both of whom you'll notice are pretty old sources. Probably Victorian, people would say. Something to be aware of is the Christian bias of Victorian anthropologists and archaeologists, which I've touched on in another video. Often they would undertake study of other cultures to justify biblical stories or to prop up their own cultures as the pinnacle that other cultures should strive toward. So I found this volume that discussed both the Fraser and Kelson sources. And it's free on the Internet Archive. Typically the newer the source, the more sound it is, and this book is from 1988 and comments on Fraser, because Fraser's piece is over 200 pages, so they couldn't include it, and includes the article by Kelson. One more thing to consider here, and kind of the reason I'm not looking at these as really viable sources, Westerners who encountered indigenous people across the world, even with the intent to record their native myths, had a tendency to mold their myths to, once again, justify or prop up Christianity. This wasn't necessarily malicious, but it did often lead to the corruption of indigenous myths, if not their full erasure or, destruction, so rarely without force. All this to say that until I can find a source from the Batak themselves that does not appear to have been influenced by Western colonizers in the past 2 centuries, I'm not sure I can take Graham Hancock's word for it that they even have a flood myth. So, to review, we've looked at Wikipedia for the Batak mythology, and for James George Fraser, then at Mark Isaac's curious taxonomy website, and finally at a book addressing both Isaac's Victorian-era sources for the Batak flood myth. We did not find a viable source for Graham Hancock's claim that the Batak had a flood myth, but then we only used Google after all. But like I said, this video is long enough. I did notice in Wikipedia the phrase, Fraser's interest in social anthropology was aroused by reading E.B. Tyler's Primitive Culture from 1871. Now, I did read a selection from Primitive Culture in college, and I can tell you that E.B. Tyler was a kind of exactly what you imagine when you think of like a racist Victorian guy. So, needless to say, probably none of his theories are even in use today or taken seriously by the field. I couldn't even tell you one. So, if that tells you what kind of person Fraser was. I can't say that he was a bad guy or a good guy or anything, but I do know that if he was inspired by the filth that I read of E.B. Tyler's, then it's probably not going to bode well for his actual, scholarship, which it's not very fair of me to say looking at it from a, 150-year distance with disdain, but I can tell you that I'm not going to take that source seriously for a Batak myth source.
A mystery crying out for investigation.
He also keeps saying that the site is just crying out for archaeological investigation. Why? So you can baselessly say that they're wrong about shit too? This is suggesting, of course, that no one has ever investigated or excavated this site, and so ignores the 1914 investigation, the 80s and 90s investigations, the work spanning 3 decades of Dr. Lutfi Yandri, whose, book I had to translate from Indonesian using Google Translate. But he determined the blocks are natural, not carved or cut, and that the part of the site that is archaeological is from no earlier than 500 BCE, as opposed to the dates of 20,000 BCE. In his book, Yandri states 3 articles written by Nadawijaja himself and Sutikno Branto, and carefully explains that while Nadawijaja insists that Gunung Padang is a pyramid, Yandri and Branto both conclude that it is merely a volcano. At about 18 minutes and 15 seconds in, Graham tells on himself as well. He says, "But the historians and the archaeologists who first excavated this site, Dr. Hillman's discovery just doesn't make sense." Well, it sounds like you just completely are rejecting what they're saying.
Which is why archaeologists were so slow to investigate it. But the way archaeology works, there's going to continue to be huge resistance to new evidence. And that's really problematic because science should be open to new evidence. And
I do wonder what he thinks evidence looks like, because I haven't really seen anything so far. I guess that's my fault for looking at the papers of the mainstream narrative, though.
What sort of reaction have you had from the archaeological profession?
They're still not accepting it.
The funding for excavations at Gunung Padang was actually cut, and that whole project was basically discontinued. But it wasn't because of the dating issue. To know why the excavations at Gunung Padang ceased, watch my other video. This was only episode 1 of Graham Hancock's 14-episode Netflix series. I can tell you that one thing mainstream archaeology doesn't have is a Netflix series. Again, I think Stephen Mithen's After the Ice would be a great way to look at prehistoric archaeological sites, because he uses a character to inspect the site as it would have looked during its historical use, and it would give a host and reenactment actors an excuse to travel to each continent, or at least 6 of the 7. Graham Hancock has completely ignored the archaeological excavations done on Mount Padang since the 1980s, so that he could further his own narrative. It is funny, also, that the original excavation occurred in the Victorian era, or close enough, in 1914, and that still did not come up with the idea that this is some grand pyramid from the Great Flood myth. I'd argue his own narrative is pretty mainstream, since you just have to open Netflix rather than read anything, and his evidence amounts to, at most, the words of a few Victorians regarding a flood myth that I was unable to substantiate outside of those Victorians. He also looked at a volcano and said it was not a volcano, but a better rundown of the methods used in that part was done by Dr. Miano. Finally, it's important to ask why Graham Hancock has a show, why he wants you to not believe the people who've dedicated their careers, and in many cases their lives, to archaeology, and why he has to distance himself from those people. I have answers for you. First, his son got him the Netflix show. Second, it's in his financial interest that you believe what Graham says rather than the archaeologists, because he doesn't need evidence to sell you a book, but they do. Finally, he has to distance himself and paint himself as a rogue rather than someone uneducated, because again, it serves his own financial interest. I'm grossed out by myself for even watching this junk, but to take a leaf from Graham's $30 book, it's my job to offer an alternative point of view. But it isn't.